And coming out in the decades after that were the young Turks of psychology who despised this whole approach because they wanted to make psychology a science, a quantitative science, an experimental science. They wanted numbers, enough of this philosophy stuff. And out of it came this very deep reflexive distrust of any behavior you couldn't see and you couldn't measure. And you didn't want to know what was going on inside anybody's personal life, inside their head, whether they were a fish or a human. All you were interested in is what was going on in the outside world just before that behavior occurred, and what behavior was it. Simple organisms as input-output black boxes. Forget this philosophy stuff. Give me something I can measure.
I think nothing ever happens without changing the organism, and mostly the nervous system. That's the most important part of the body when it comes to changes in behavior. I assume that there are always physiological changes going on. I'm not talking about a black box. That I did not invent the expression the empty organism, and I don't believe the organism is empty. I want to work as closely with physiology as possible. I think a good behavioral account is the very best thing you can do for the physiologists by telling them precisely what the assignment is. Am I answering your question or not? That's what I think is going on, but I have no other instruments to tell me the nature of those changes going on. I don't say because I don't know, but the physiologist is finding instruments to get in there and find out.
What are the key features of it? First one was this hysterical, radical, extreme environmentalism. The notion that we are all tabula rasas and whatever that is, that we are all blank slates and all that we come in with is this blank slate to be written on by environment. Don't tell me about genes, don't tell me about biology at all, don't tell me about anything other than what's going on in the environment and how does that shape the behavior coming out the other end, and can I measure it? Extreme radical environmentalism in terms of gene environment. There were no genes. There were no interactions as far as they were concerned.
Sauss and others have said that behaviorism is reductionistic and dehumanizes man. As I've pointed out, it dehomunculizes man. If you believe that the body is steered and run by a little man inside, then behaviorism gets rid of that little man. The body is run by its own structure, the genetic endowment of the species, and its history and contact with the environment and the current environment. I think that is compatible with the most noble view of human nature. I see no dehumanizing about it. The thing that bothers me about these references to behaviorism as being manipulative, and another question brought that up, is this. Chomsky and others have repeatedly said that behaviorism is associated with manipulative political philosophies, by which he means, I suppose, fascism. And as a matter of fact, I have been called fascist, but nothing in anything that I've ever done is in the slightest extent similar to what's happened under what I would call fascist governments. The issue is this: if you think that human behavior is determined primarily by genetic programming, and this is what you mean when you talk about the development of human behavior. Shakespeare had 7 ages, Erik Erikson has 10, Freud had different ones depending upon when you look at Freud's work and so on, but things are growing in the individual. You're born with a knowledge of grammar according to Chomsky and so on. You know the rules of grammar. If you think that we develop in the sense of grow like an embryo, and Chomsky has said, Roger Brown has said that the development of language is like embryonic growth, then you're at one end of the continuum. At the other end, you say that behavior is due to what happens during the lifetime of the individual. You don't deny that you start with an organism, and that is genetic, but it is pliable, manipulable, you can change it. Then, quite clearly, in that case, manipulation is at the end of the environmental end of the continuum. Because you can change the environment. You can't change the genetic endowment except very slowly through some kind of genetic program. And nobody pays much attention to eugenics these days or any kind of effort. You can't make people speak grammatically by breeding people with better innate grammar. It don't work that way. If you want to teach people to be grammatical, you teach better grammar in schools. Well, if those are the two ends, then you ask which is going to be the one politically most associated with, let's say, vicious political practices. Well, I submit that if you know how to change the environment and are concerned with things like education, therapy, and so on, you will use those ways to bring about the kinds of changes that are important. If you, on the other hand, don't, if you believe this thing is all born into you, then you can't change in any reasonable way at all, and you turn into the most violent ways. The person who really believed in the genetic programming of behavior in the 20th century was Adolf Hitler. That's racism. And Chomsky is absolutely 180 degrees wrong about this. It isn't that racism follows, that it isn't that the concentration camp follows from a theory of innate behavior. It is that when you believe that behavior is innate, you can't think of anything else to do but a final solution which involves a concentration camp. When you are concerned about changing behavior and can do so, then you don't turn to the vicious methods. You turn to better schools, better forms of therapy, better incentive systems, better rehabilitation programs, and so on. So I would say just the opposite from Chomsky, that a good practical behavior modification makes it possible to be humane in dealing with people, whereas the genetic approach leaves you open to nothing but violence.
The final piece of it was this notion of universality, which is it works this way in everybody. It works this way in every single species out there. And if you want to study lab rats, you're going to learn the exact same thing as if you were studying giraffe, but it's a lot harder to study them in a lab. You sure don't need to study them out in their natural habitat, because it's just understanding the reinforcements coming in, the behavior coming out the other end. They're all the same.
A common view in psychology, not our view, I think, is that the true subject matter of psychology is some inner process of thought that lies behind behavior. And behavior is often thought of as a mere symptom, almost a trivial byproduct of this inner thinking process. What do you make then of that inner-outer distinction?
Well, I think the reason that we now question the inner thing, the reason there's been a behavioristic revolution, is that we now know more about the behavior. Up until 1913, at least, no one seriously said that you can forget about these internal things and look at the behavior. But that was only possible because people had begun to study behavior. Now, behaviorism didn't amount to much for 25 years because we didn't know much about it, about what people do. The rats ran through mazes and dogs salivated the bells and whatnot. But there was no real science of the behavioral antecedents of behavior, of the environmental antecedents of behavior. Once they had been discovered and very carefully worked out, there was something else to explain what we do in addition to what we're feeling. And then you realize that once you have a science of behavior which establishes the role of the environment, two sciences really, ethology, the role of natural selection, and experimental analysis of behavior is the role of the environment of the individual through operant conditioning. Once you have that science, then there's less need to look inside for a cause, and eventually you can simply say there's no need at all, because what is inside is the product of the history. So what happens is, as I grew up as a baby and a child and an adult, was that my body was slowly changed by contingency to reinforcement. It remained a body produced by natural selection. And that as soon as we understand the environmental sources of what I do all the way along, we don't need to bother about how it feels when I'm doing it. But what philosophers have done for 2,500 years at least is to try to look more and more closely at what they feel or what they see introspectively. And of course, they never have got anywhere. And Plato is still taught today in departments of philosophy, you see, 2,500 years later. And moreover, the cognitive psychology has given up on introspection. Psychology in general has. Do you find a psychologist sitting around observing mental life anymore? No. The cognitive processes are inferences, which you establish by hypotheses and inferences and so on. I don't know of a single psychologist who sits around and watches a stream of consciousness or is a trained observer in the Wundtian tradition. So the behavioristic attack on introspection has been totally successful. Introspection is now out as a process of science. It's still there with philosophy, and they can have it, and they will. But the good philosophers, I would say someone like Bertrand Russell, I think, realizes that you can't get much out of introspection, although it's interesting to look at yourself and your thinking, but you've got eventually to get back to physical explanation.
All the same. This period, dominated by the behaviorists, was historically a total drag because these guys had just a stranglehold on the field, and all of them looked the same. If you ever look in one of those Time Life books on history of the mind or whatever, there will be the inevitable picture of B.F. Skinner with some pigeon, and Skinner was like your archetypal, at a central casting behaviorist. He had this inordinately shiny forehead and these big glasses, and every picture of him, for some reason, photographers were always forced to kneel down and take a picture of him looming over with his pigeon, and everything considered, this was an incredibly frightening looking man. And he would then be free to go on with astonishing quotes like, "Dog, cat, rat, child, doesn't matter, it's all the same."
It began to be said that I was the modern representative of John Locke back in the 17th century, the British empiricist who felt that the mind began as a clean slate, a tabula rasa, and that all knowledge came from experience, while Chomsky was the modern intellectual descendant of René Descartes, the rationalist who believed that you had to think even before you were aware that you existed. Newsweek magazine wrote an article along these lines several years ago, and more or less implied that I was winning out. This enraged the Chomskyites, and a flood of letters came in, of which Newsweek thought it wise to publish 4. Each one, in its own way, repeated a common misunderstanding of my position. One contended that I am a stimulus-response psychologist, which I am not. Another contended that I think people are nothing more than pigeons, which I do not. The one I liked best had at least a touch of wit. Going back to those 17th century progenitors, the letter writer advised Newsweek to lock up Skinner and give Chomsky Descartes blanche. But even that is curiously malapropos. Chomsky doesn't want a carte blanche. That's too much like a tabula rasa. He wants the table d'hôte, arranged by some unseen hand in the kitchen. Now, ironically, Chomsky was later asked to give the John Locke lectures at Oxford. Well, I was at the University of Cambridge at the time, and the philosophers at Oxford had me come over before Chomsky arrived to sort of prepare the way. And then the BBC thought it would be fun to have us debate this issue on television. I don't know what reason Chomsky gave for refusing. I imposed some qualifications. Chomsky talks a great deal. If anyone wants to disprove Alfred Adler's thesis that a man goes into a field in which he has some natural shortcoming, I suggest he cite Noam Chomsky. I said that I would debate, provided the master of ceremonies could guarantee equal time. And I suggested that we use chess clocks. My clock would be running when I was talking. Chomsky's clock would be running while Chomsky was talking. And in this way, I plan to have the last 15 or 20 minutes to myself.
Apples. One of the great urban legends is that humans are innately scared of spiders and snakes. Humans are not, because there's all sorts of cultures where people love spiders, and where in fact they love spiders because they love to chase after them and pull their legs out and then cook them up and eat them. And people are not scared of spiders then and getting the sort of willies from them. It is not innate, but humans show prepared learning for being scared of spiders and snakes, which is you can show in humans and in monkeys as well the conditioning that's needed to associate, for example, a picture of a spider with the autonomic response to a mild shock versus a picture of, you know, Disneyland and Mickey, and associated that it takes less of an association for we primates to associate something like a spider or a snake picture with something unpleasant than all sorts of other animate stimuli.
There's a whole field of psychological research on what's called problem solving or concept formation. You know, people are shown cards with curly lines or straight lines and red borders or blue borders and so on. What people do in trying to identify the critical features of the stimuli is often called hypothesis making.
Yes.
How would you talk about that?
Well, a hypothesis is something supposed to be inside, and that's I object to that, absolutely. I think the old word association is a good example, is a very simple example. Pavlov's dogs associated the bell with the food. Not at all. Pavlov associated them. Associate means to put together, and it was Pavlov who did that. The interesting thing is that having associated the bell with the food, the dog begins to respond to the bell. Now that is not association by the dog, it's associated by Pavlov. The same thing is true of concept formation. The various Ernstein's experiment, very fascinating experiment. You show a pigeon hundreds of slides, in some of which there are people, and in others not. And in a surprising short time, the pigeons will respond in one way to a slide with a person in it, and another way to a slide without. Now, it's a mistake to say, though, I think, that the pigeon has acquired the concept of person. The concept is in the apparatus. The concept was formed when you reinforced responses to slides with people and extinguished responses to slides without people. You formed the concept. The remarkable thing is that pigeons can respond in that different way, but without having a concept in the head to help them.